Okay, let's begin assignment number 2. Assignment number 2 is going to be made using slabs. Now, slabs are going to be very important in later assignments too, so it's a skill you're going to want to master. And we're going to use these slabs to make some cool tiles, and if you notice, all these tiles have 4 holes in them, one in each corner, and that is so that when they are finished they are going to be woven together as a group art piece, almost like a quilt. So I am going to ask you to give me one of your tiles. You're going to make several and you can keep the others, but one I want to keep for this group art piece, and those holes have to be there for it to work. So imagine you're going to stick a wire through there or a fat piece of yarn, okay? No teeny tiny little hole. Make sure that it goes all the way through too. When you poke it from the front, check the back to make sure it's gone all the way through. And these tiles are 4 inches by 4 inches. We're going to try to keep them all about the same size. Okay, so first step is what you're going to do is wedge your piece and get all the air bubbles out. Now I already did that before we started, so you don't have to watch me do that all over again, but you do have to do it at home. You have to do that every time to prevent explosion. So my piece is pretty huge. It's probably at least twice as big as what you're going to want to have at home. I'm going to try to make a really large slab so that I can make multiple tiles and show you the different types of tiles that you can make, but you should be just making one at a time at home for now. So the bigger the slab, the harder it will be. So start with a little bit of a smaller piece of clay, probably about the same amount or a little bit more than you made your pinch pot with. And I'm kind of pressing down with my hand and making kind of a hamburger patty shape. So I'm already beginning the slab myself. I'm sort of cheating and getting it started ahead of time before I use the rolling pin. Now, you may not have a rolling pin at home. I had suggested maybe you could use a tin can, which will work, but it will leave some texture on there. If you want it to be smooth, you can use a water bottle. So I'm going to use a water bottle just to show you that you really don't need any fancy tools. And I'm standing up and leaning into it. It's going to take some muscle, and you're going to have to put your weight into it. So you're going to just keep rolling and rolling and rolling. Now, if you think about it, the amount of clay is going to resist your weight and your efforts, but the closer you get to the edge, the less clay there is to resist. So it gets easier as you roll towards the edges. So for that reason, you want to spend more time in the middle. The middle is the part that needs more effort. When you get to the edge, if you keep going all the way to the edge and then off of the board like that, you're going to make it thinner and thinner and thinner until your edges are so thin that they won't be strong enough to hold together. So kind of stay away from the edges and roll the whole thing out. You can push in to really thick areas and then smooth them out afterwards. And you can also sort of balance yourself out by just rotating your board like this and rotating it. Now, we talked about air bubbles being a problem. The thicker your clay is, the more likely it is to have air bubbles. So for that reason, you can never make things with clay that are just totally solid clay all the way through. They just have too much of a tendency to explode, and additionally they're going to be extremely heavy and just kind of impractical. So all clay sculptures and pieces that you see are hollow on the inside. And you're going to want to keep that in mind throughout this entire class, that there is sort of a maximum and a minimum thickness for everything. So the maximum thickness is about the thickness of this paint stick. This is not a tiny paint stick, this is one of the bigger ones. You know, about the thickness of your pinky. You don't really want it thicker than that. Now you also don't want it a whole lot thinner than that, because it's going to be super fragile and it could break. It could break even before you get it fired, which is the real time when we worry the most about things breaking, and especially if they're super thin. Now, I've had some practice doing this, so my slab is pretty much consistent all the way through. And as you're doing this, you may even see little air bubbles where they will appear, and you can see that they're still in there even though I wedged my clay. Some of you will have a hard time getting your slab flat and consistent, since this will be your first time doing this. So one way that you can cheat is to take 2 paint sticks and put them on either side of your slab, and that way your rolling pin will be rolling on the paint stick, and it can never go farther than that. So that basically puts like a brake on your rolling pin so that everything becomes consistent. And I'll show you that at a different angle so you can get a better look. Okay, so here's a better angle so you can see the paint stick setup. So you're putting 1 paint stick on each side of your slab, and it should be ideally a little bit closer together so that your pin lays on it. And see how like the rolling pin can't go farther than the paint stick, so that's going to keep it nice and consistent all the way around. And I'm going to put a lot of extra time into the middle, and then when I go to the edge, I'm going to be really delicate, and I'm not going to push the edge and make the edge super thin. Alright, so I've got a pretty decent slab. The first thing I want you to do is make sure that your slab is not stuck to the board. If you have put a bunch of water and gotten things all wet, it's going to be sticky. So, see, I'm going to peel it up, and it's stuck, but it's not totally stuck. And the important thing is that I'm unsticking it before I put a lot of work into it. If you've just put like 2 hours making the perfect creation and then you can't get it off the board, you're going to be upset. So we have an assignment. I've written it all out for you. This is getting serious now. This is an art class. So we will learn some technical terms, and I will post this on your classroom page so that you can read it easier. And we're going to be learning some fancy art terms. You will not be tested on them, but someday you may hear one of these words and say, I know what that means because Miss Samantha taught me that. And then you're going to say to yourself, she really was such a nice teacher. I should have been nicer to her when I was young. I'm just kidding. Okay, so I'm going to make 2 tiles. You're probably at home just making 1 at a time. Anyways, I do want you to make more than 1. So the last classes, I gave them 4 types of tiles to make, and they got to choose 2. So you're not required to make 4, but you can make 4. And you know, because at the when we were at the school, we had such a limited time that we just only could really make 2. But if you want to make all 4, go for it. And I will try to be getting more clay, so if you run out, let me know and I'll try to get you some more as we go along. Okay, so I've got my ruler and I'm going to measure 4 inches on each side, and then I'm going to take the wire tool and cut along the ruler. Now, as we said before, you don't have to have the wire tool. You could have a paper clip that's been bent, and that should do the same thing. You could use the paint stick as a straight edge or some other straight thing. You do need an actual real ruler to make it 4 inches. Let's find inches. So what I'm gonna do is go like this, mark where 4 inches is, and then do like that. I'm just going to use my paper clip this time to show you how you can do it. You push against the edge of the paint stick and it will just slice away just like that. I apologize for these less than professional filming techniques. Hopefully you can see what's going on here. I am just marking 4 inches on both sides, so it's 4 by 4. 4 inches by 4 inches. Make sure that you start at the 0 and not at the 1. That seems to be a common mistake. Okay, so we're back here and I have cut 4 by 4 tiles. You've probably cut just one. You can see they're not exactly perfect, and that's okay. This is art. We're not gonna tile your bathroom with these tiles. So the next thing you're gonna do is just peel these pieces away, all these extra pieces and scraps, and we're going to smush them into one big blob. Okay, so what you're doing is you're decreasing the surface area, and so less of the clay is exposed to air when it's all together in one big blob, and it's not going to dry out. If you just leave your little scraps all over the place and forget about them, by the time you remember them, they're going to be kind of hard and dry. So I'm going to put it all back into a blob, put some water on it, and put it back into the bag so that it stays moist. Okay, and now here I am with my tiles. So the main thing that we are going to learn today is how to apply pattern and texture. So what is pattern? pattern is a sequence of similar shapes and sizes. So what I want you to learn about pattern is that anyone can do it. So you don't have to be a Leonardo da Vinci and have amazing drawing skills. As long as you have patience and can just repeat the same simple step over and over again, you can create a pattern. So the first type of pattern that I want to try is called finger texture. So you can see here in this book there are some examples of textures that were made in clay just by using the fingers. And if you just do something simple like that and then put them all together, you can create kind of an amazing piece of artwork. So patience is more important than talent. So the way you're going to do your finger texture is to push your fingers together like this and pinch and make a ridge. So here's one that we've made in the past, and it's just been pinched to make a ridge, and then it creates this little pool where the glaze can pool, and that also has a cool effect. So for the first one, instead of doing a swirl like that, I'm going to try to do some kind of like scale textures. So maybe I can do like this. And then maybe here I'll do the ridge. And then we'll do more scale textures. And we'll do another ridge. And then you can go over it a second time to make it even more defined, like that. And you can see I sort of wasn't straight, but that's okay. This is art. Nobody wants a computer-made piece of art. They want something that looks like a real human being made it. So that's your first type of tile, which is finger texture. The second type that we want to do is stamping. So I've collected some things, and if you watch the materials video, you've probably been collecting some things. What some of you may not know about me is that I used to live in Hawaii, and I was obsessed with collecting seashells. I looked for them all day, and I dreamt about them all night. Now, I never took them alive. I only took the ones that had been dead on the shore. We don't want a species going extinct just so we can have a souvenir. But I thought that these could make some cool stamps, and the bowl that they're in shows how applying pattern can make something very intricate out of something very simple. So if you look at the flower, it's just a dot and lines, and everyone can make a dot and lines, but when you repeat them over and over again, you get something intricate and beautiful. So this is going to be my stamp texture tile. I am going to take my clothing pin and make some lines. Okay, and I think I'll take this channeled whelk. This is a native seashell. I think that might make a cool. Now, I already took all my scraps and balled them into a ball, but one thing that you could do is test beforehand. So you could use those little scraps as you're testing. You might have something that you think is going to be awesome, and then once you try it, it turns out not quite what you thought it would be. I'm going to fill this in a little bit. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about some art concepts in stamping. Stamping is what was considered negative reliefs. So that means you're creating a negative space, basically like a hole or a pool, into the clay. And we're using the objects and we're pressing in. Our next project will do the opposite. But once we have learned repetition, you can learn basically different types of pattern. So you could have sequences going in opposite directions. So let's say I use this popsicle stick to make like a crescent moon shape. I can do the crescent moon going this way. We call that movement, and then I could reverse it. We'd call that counter movement, where we're doing the reverse. So you've got movement, counter movement. We could do alternating, where I alternate it each time, switching it. You could alternate the rows, or you could alternate each stamp. Now, you may not want to use as much of a variety as I'm using. Typically, simplicity actually will add to your piece, and it will lead into that repetition. If you don't have repetition, you don't have pattern. I'm going to keep doing some different stamps just as an example of what's possible. But as you can see, this one is very simple. I did just the clothespin and the seashell only. It's very repetitive, but it may be more appealing than something that has so many different kinds. We have a granulated cowrie This seashell is endemic to Hawaii. Endemic means it can only be found there. Granulated means it has these ridges. I think those ridges might be cool. So I'm going to try them out. Oh yeah, that turned out good. Now I could do 2 vertical and then 2 horizontal. 2 vertical and then 2 horizontal. I want to add some alternation. Okay, let's see what this looks like. This is a scallop. You can tell a scallop because it has these wings, these corners on the tip. Scallops are rare. You've probably found a lot of cockles on the South Carolina beach, but every once in a while you'll find a scallop. Now, a scallop is a bivalve. What does bivalve mean? Well, in Latin it means 2, right? Bi means 2. Valves or 2 shells, so it's a clam, right? It has 2 shells, whereas our channeled whelk is what we call a univalve, which means it has just 1 shell. So these shells are created by the creatures that live inside them. So they're building their own home, and they're doing that by extracting minerals and chemicals from the ocean water and then reconstituting them, having molecular chemical reactions in their bodies and turning that into calcium carbonate, and they're actually excreting the shell and building it themselves with their bodies. So if you look closely at a whelk, everything big starts out tiny. And this whelk started out only the size of that little point in the middle, right there. And then as it grew, it just started adding layer upon layer. Like you can see the ridges, and it's kind of like almost like the rings in a tree, except they don't correspond to a year the way a tree does, because they don't grow necessarily according to the same yearly seasonal cycles that a tree does. But you can see its growth pattern. It started out tiny and then just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So you're always going to learn a little bit of biology with me, even in ceramics class. And typically the color of the shell is also coming from the body of the creature. So like this huge conch right here, the actual snail, when it was living, it was pink. That's what gives it that pink pigment. And the longer the shell has been dead without its living body, the duller the color becomes. So when you find a perfect seashell that's shiny and perfect and brightly colored, that means the animal just died, or it means someone killed it. Probably that's the case if you're buying it in a store. I always recommend finding your own. Let's see, let's try some coral. I also have an alligator scoot. It's a little plate of bone that is like a scale for the alligator, but they actually have a bone underneath each scale, and those are just separate from the rest of the body. So you might find these out in nature around a pond. All these things can be used as stamps. All right, so we have completed the second type of tile, which is stamping or negative relief. So the third type of tile is going to be embellishment. We're going to be using embellishment. Now, what is embellishment? It is the opposite of stamping. It is positive relief as opposed to negative relief. So we're basically adding on pieces of clay, which are going to be raising above the surface. Okay, people will call that applied surface ornamentation. So what is ornamentation? It's just anything that's kind of added on as decoration. So humans, we apply ornamentation all the time to ourselves. We wear clothes that we like, jewelry that we like, and we are embellishing when we do that. So this is going to introduce a few new concepts, and we're going to start out with making the embellishments that we're going to add on. So this is something you've probably done with Play-Doh at home. We're going to make a coil. So to make a coil, you start out making like a small hot dog shape, and so you're doing the same thing with the slab, where you're kind of making a rough version of the shape beforehand, and then you're going to take your hands and roll like this. And you're going to roll it as tiny as you can. We want some delicate detail, so we're going tiny. Now, if it breaks, that's fine. You're just going to then have separate coils. Now it's getting a little bit dry. I can dip my hand in my little cup of water, add some moisture to it. The smaller a piece is, the more surface area it has compared to its total mass. More of that mass is on the surface, which means it's open to the air and evaporation. That's why tiny little creatures like mice have to have higher metabolisms, because they're tiny and they get cold faster. So same with all matter, surface area makes a big difference. Okay, so I've got my coil. Then I'm gonna take some more clay and I'm going to make some tiny little balls. So when we made the spear, we rolled it between two palms. For the tiny balls, we can just roll them between our fingers like this. Okay, Now, here comes the important part. You're about to learn a super important technique in using clay, which is basically called scoring and slipping. So I've got my slip right here, which is some clay that's had water added to it. I just use this bowl, and then when the clay dries, I just let it sit there dry, and then when I'm ready, I just add water to it. So it's like mortar, and you're going to use it like mortar. Mortar is the stuff that we use to hold bricks together. So you can even add a little bit of water. I usually like to have a little bit of water kind of on the surface. And then you don't need to have both a water and a slip jar. You can just have sort of both in one jar. Now, that's the slip. Now the other part of scoring and slipping is scoring. So the best tool for scoring is a fork, but you could use a wire tool or your paper clip or anything like that. So you're basically scratching the surface. So you're making like little hashtags, and you want to go both directions. And you're going to score both sides of whatever's being connected. So not just the surface it's being connected to. I'm gonna dip this in water, and I'm gonna put some more water on my snake because it's dried out. And I'm going to rough up the surface. So I say hashtag, doesn't really matter what it looks like as long as you're roughing it up. You're giving it even more surface area where the two pieces can attach to one another. Then I'm going to go to the slip, and you can use a paintbrush if you like. I just like to use my fingers and get right in there. And I'm going to apply some of that slip here and some on my snake or coil, whatever you want to call it. And then we're going to stick it on. Now this is important, and in addition to the scoring and slipping, I'm making pressure. I'm applying pressure. Okay, and then I can just cut that off where I want it, and then I can smooth out the rest. Now, what happens if you don't score and slip? That coil will just fall right off as soon as it dries, and I will be able to tell that you didn't do what I asked you to do, because I can just look at the bottom of the coil and see whether it's been scored or not. So we want that to stick. Now we can kind of test it. See how when I'm kind of like trying to wobble it just a little bit, and make sure it has somewhat of a suction and that it's attached, and I can press it in a little bit more. So that is an example of embellishment, right? Because it's kept coming up off the surface. It's positive relief. It's not a stamp that's going down in. Now, for the balls, I'm just going to dip them into the slip. These are very tiny. It's a lot harder to do on something tiny. You definitely want to do it with bigger things. And I'm going to put some of that slip here, and we'll be going over this again in the future and repeating it. And I'm going to attach my ball. Now is the time when you might want to use your pencil. So the main reason that tools are useful is sometimes your fingers are too big. So really your fingers are always your best tool until you've got something really small, and then you might want to use the tip of the pencil to get in there and smooth out the edges. And you can also use the pencil to do your scoring and slipping. Okay, so I don't want to bore you. I do want you to take your time, but you don't have to watch me doing all this. I'm going to show you some examples from a book, okay, of what people have done with this technique. So that is just a bunch of tiny coils added. A lot of patience, but a very simple technique that anyone can do. And here you have the positive relief almost creates, in addition, negative relief, because it takes your attention to the areas that are lower than the embellishment. Here you have an example of a fish pattern that was made by the earlier pinching technique. Remember when we made the linear ridges with our fingers? So that brings me to our next project, which is I would like you to make a image that is made out of pattern. So that means that you're not going to draw. I don't want you just to draw. I want to teach you something you don't already know how to do. So here they made the shape of a bird by adding little balls, right? So even though it's a bird, there's a pattern in there, right? So the little balls and the repetitive lines of the coil are creating pattern. Here's some examples of the stamping. There you have movement and counter movement. And here you have a symbolic image made of stamps. So the symbolic image is a flower, right? Everyone knows that that's a flower, but it's not drawn onto the page. So stamps are being used to repeatedly create the image. So my assignment to you is to come up with an image that you want to make. So let's say you wanted to make a flower. In order to limit yourself to see what you can do with pattern, I want you to limit yourself to 3 tools. So I'm going to have my 3 tools be this screw, this pen top, and this seashell. Okay? So what I'll do is let's say I want to make a stem. Well, the stamp doesn't have to look like a stem. My stamp is a circle, but I'm gonna just repeat the circles until I have the shape of a stem. Okay, then let's say I want to do a sunflower. We know that sunflowers are actually compound flowers, and the real flowers are on the inside of the face. The petals that we think are petals are actually modified leaves. If you look closely at a sunflower, it has a million little miniature flowers, and actually they're in an amazing geometric shape that is called Fibonacci's spiral that I can't replicate here, but it is replicated all over the place in nature. So the purpose of this assignment is to introduce the use of pattern and texture, and to show you that there's other ways to create images other than just drawing with lines, than line drawing. So I'm going to take my little seashell here. Now you don't have to do a flower. You can do anything you want. You could do a fish, a house, a tree. We had a lot of trees one class that turned out really well. We've had people do dragonflies, frogs, sunbursts. So there's my sunflower. Now I chose stamps that were all circles. You might want to create a little bit more contrast and have like some circles and rectangles to mix it up a little bit. I could do smaller leaves over here. So I'm doing it kind of quick. Okay, so we're getting near our ending point. I spared you the torture of watching me make a bunch of tiny little balls. And we've got our 4 different types of tiles. And this one, what I found was that I really wasn't that happy with my final product, so I just signed it and made this the back and flipped it over and tried again. So I actually cheated. I used more than 3 stamps. I think I ended up using 5. I used the granulated cowrie, the scallop shell, the whelk, the clothespin, and then the tip of the screw to do some dot writing. And I used the scallop, just the edges, to make the grass. So the reason for limiting you on how many stamps you can use is so that you, let's say you're trying to make a palm tree, you don't say, well, let's find something that looks like a trunk and let's find something that looks like a sunshine. No, you're going to take that something, whatever you have, and then use it in a repetitive way to create a trunk or create a sunshine. But in the end, really, you know, it's up to you. The rules are there for guidance. So what I found with this was that I had intended actually to make flowers, not palm trees, but then they looked more like palm trees. So instead of adding little side leaves, I decided to leave them that way. And then I, at first, had wanted to do uppercase, but then I realized I had started lowercase, and so I just made the P into a little flower. So that's the cool thing about art, is that mistakes can then turn into the coolest thing about your project, or it could take a totally different turn altogether and just go with it and relax. And that's how art works. Sometimes the best things you make were mistakes, or you end up making something cool trying to cover up a mistake. So it's always workable. Don't give up. Now, more importantly, there's a few things we have to do before we're finished, and that is we have to make the 4 holes, one in each corner. Now, I found that this skewer, this is like a shish kebab skewer, worked really well, and I just poked the hole in the corner like that, and then lifted it up, push it all the way through, like between my 2 fingers, like that. Then make sure it comes out the other side. You might want to brush off any extra and make sure it's clean and open. So you want a nice, clean, open hole. You don't want tiny little hole that you're never going to be able to get even fishing line through. Now, you don't want to make the hole too close to the edge. See how the hole's not right up against the edge? That would make it really easy to break the area between the edge and the hole. You want it to be thick enough that it's going to be strong enough. If I try to make the hole right in the corner, I could just break off the corner. Okay, now the other big deal was that I signed my name to the back of every piece. If you don't sign your name, I could just give it away to somebody else. I won't know whose it is. Now, let's say you don't have a skewer. You can use your bent paper clip and put the hole like that. Now, the hole's skinnier, so what I have to do is work it and just rub it around and make the hole bigger that way. See? So I stick it in and work it around like this to make the hole nice and big. And then it's going to be wide enough to get something through. To make sure there's no little pieces of clay stuck in there. There we go. Now, this one, it's not that bad, it's okay, but I'm not super happy with it. It's still soft, so I'm just gonna smush it up like that. If I feel like it's not worth the clay, like that I'd rather make something else, I can even, dip it in the water a little bit and smush it. I might want to use that clay to make something better. So it wasn't a waste of my time because I learned a lot of techniques when I made that, and I practiced. So practice makes perfect. Sometimes people make it seem like all you want to do in life is succeed and you never want to fail. Well, if you don't fail, you don't learn anything. So every failure teaches you something, and that's the true success, is having failed enough times that you know exactly how to do it right. So practice. I'm gonna smush this, and then let's say it's harder than I would like it to be, and this is valuable stuff, so I want to use it. I'm gonna take this pencil, poke some holes in it, then I'm taking my cup of water going to pour some water into the holes. Fill the holes with water. You can do that with a spray bottle. It's a little less messy. And then look, I'm closing the hole. So I'm like closing the water into the hole. That means it's going to be absorbed inside the clay. So just through simple osmosis, the clay will become uniformly moist. So you've probably learned about osmosis. It's basically a type of diffusion. Wherever there's more of something, it wants to move to where there's less of something. So if there's more water in those holes than there is around the holes, the water will naturally diffuse through osmosis throughout the dry parts of the clay and become moist. Now that process is going to take a little time, so I'm going to put it in the bag, and I'm going to smush it and try to make it one with the rest of my clay. Remember, the less surface area the better. So instead of like a bunch of tiny little balls in the bag, we want one big blob. Okay? And then I'm going to take the water and just spritz some water in there, make it nice and moist, seal it really good, twist it, and put a rubber band around it. Now, these ones, these are mostly done. I tell you what, that little balls and coils job was a lot more difficult than I thought it was. So when you look at this, it gives you a whole new appreciation for just what these people did. So a lot of people like to go to art museums, look at stuff like this rooster here and say, I could do that, but they didn't do that. So doing is a lot harder than just being able to do something. So the proof is, can you walk the talk? I tell you, after making all those little balls, I have a lot more appreciation for this rooster right here. Okay. Enough philosophy. We have got to set these aside for drying. So I'm gonna take my pieces over to a nice cardboard box. I've got it with my other pieces. I'm gonna collect them in a box, and I want you to do the same thing. Once you've collected several, then I want you to leave them on the front porch of the school and put my name on them. Your name will be on the bottom of the pieces, and I will get them fired. So I'm going to let these dry flat on the cardboard. Once they're dry, if I want to save space, I could pick this up and even just set it on there. That would be fine. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to do something to make it dry slower. So if I let it dry too fast, it could crack or it could warp. Now, that might not be a big deal for like this pinch pot. You know, if it warped, it would still be cool. But let's say, you know, something like a tile that you want to sit flat, you want to definitely slow down its drying time, because it can just like bend and all of a sudden it doesn't, you know, look like a tile anymore. So the way I'm going to do that is pretty simple. I'm just going to take this plastic bag and I'm just going to sort of stuff it over top, and I'm not sealing it, right? I haven't put a rubber band, so it's still going to dry. It's just going to take longer to dry than it would if I hadn't done that. And the longer, the better. That makes it less likely to warp. So there you go. Our second project is complete. Your 4 different types of patterns include finger texture, which is like this, or linear texture, or stamping, which is like this, or embellishment, which is when you're adding on, or symbolic image, which would be something like this, where you use repetition of pattern to create an image. And here's some other things that we've done with tiles that aren't, you know, specific to the assignment. You can make little signs to explain things, all kinds of possibilities. I would like to thank you for taking the time to hang out with me and Tallulah today. Until next time, stay well.